Great. So I'll try to select some. We've had a good response, and probably most of them could be answered by one, but if more than one of you wants to pipe up, that's totally fine. So is NASA working with DARPA Draco on nuclear thermal propulsion?
Yes.
I'm going to need more questions if you get it.
Okay. No, we are very extensively. So that Draco is their DARPA's nuclear thermal propulsion demonstration project. We're working very closely with them, both with the technical capabilities and some of the NASA facilities, but also on the kind of a long-term nuclear thermal propulsion development plan. Also working very closely with Department of Energy. We have an active activity out right now with four companies developing NASA's version of a nuclear thermal propulsion capability, and that's closely tied to the DARPA activities. Yeah, Anthony Calamino, who works with us at headquarters, is our nuclear thermal lead. So there is tight coordination between what NASA is doing and DARPA, and a lot of interest, quite frankly.
Thank you. So this was touched upon in one of the talks, but after Viper, there are no ice prospecting missions currently on the books. How is NASA planning to close the gap of high-resolution mapping for ice reserves in the polar regions, particularly close to Artemis Base Camp?
Yeah, and this was certainly listed as one of our gaps, and one of the gaps that we listed in red. So something we keep pushing on is continued efforts in this area. Obviously, Viper is a great starting point. There is a great base being built up with that in terms of how to approach the mapping and do the geostatistical modeling to pull that forward. But dedicated efforts in this area are something we really need to keep pushing on. I encourage you, there's a Lunar Surface Science Workshop coming up in May that we've been organizing specifically on this topic. It'll be a two-parter in June, the end of June, and then we'll have a second part later to try to kind of focus this down and really do and develop an approach to how to approach this as a campaign moving forward, not just with NASA, but internationally. So that's one way we can try to keep pushing this message forward. Obviously, the LWIMS report and other things, we're kind of pushing on all this. But certainly, if we're going after the water, that's something we need to develop and keep moving that forward. I keep saying that, but yeah, it's certainly a gap that we're trying to address. I think. Yeah, and it was in the decadal as well. That's right.
Great, thank you. Will the power system on the moon be primarily AC/DC or about half and half? Will long-range transmission specifically be AC or high-voltage DC?
That trade is wide open. Again, the decision about which voltage to use is dependent on, again, transmission distance, and that will affect, you get AC system may weigh less than a DC system for that application, and the mass of the converting, the boost and buck converters at either end. The boost and buck converters at either end. Those can vary widely between AC and DC. So the optimal solution is highly dependent upon really the distance being transmitted. And that is something that is less a function of our technology planning than it is of the mission architects themselves. So our technology efforts need to be able to support either one.
Thanks. So, yesterday we heard that NASA has a focused goal of eventually getting onto Mars, but also that sort of growing commercial side of Moon is important too. So, as NASA eventually starts to focus more on Mars, what infrastructure should the community see as they might be reasonable to rely on being left behind at that point?
So I'll start, and then Walt can add in. So firstly, what I would say is, if I had to say what feels different to me this time, then we've been talking about these things forever, right? But what feels different this time to me, and especially in this community working together through these focus groups, is I think we are now more aligned than ever before, and it's came up here quite a bit in all the talks between NASA, international partners, and industry, right? And we've talked a lot about, what does sustainability mean to folks and all of that. And then before you even get to sustainability, we have infrastructure. So all these 6 capability areas that we keep harping on here, right, that we're talking about in detail, are because we do need a core amount of power We have to be able to get to the locations we need to get to and access those. We have to be able to survive the environments, all of these things, right? So what we're really focusing on right now is how do we come together? That's why we're really identifying these key technology gaps. How do we close in on those gaps to get to that infrastructure? It's going to take all of those stakeholders I just mentioned to do that. That's what these Envisioned futures are about. That's what things like our ACOs and tipping points are about, that are all coordinated with our other mission directorates and our external stakeholders. That's why we want your feedback on these RFIs. So the bottom line is that the beauty of the story, yes, NASA has to go to the moon as a test bed to learn to go to Mars, right? We will be doing that. Along the way, of course, in parallel, we're developing that commercial lunar economy. Those are not separate things. Those are happening in conjunction because these are all capabilities we need to develop at the same time. So I do think that a lot of what we're doing today, a lot of the Envisioned futures we're talking about, the feedback we get there, how we prioritize those gaps, how we invest together in developing those things in the next 10 plus years will ultimately determine what you're asking there, Ben. But I think at the end of the day, we will have that infrastructure established. Speaking of infrastructure, Mark just came and plugged. And, you know, I'll use ISRU as a real quick example, right? ISRU is a capability we all know that we need and want. NASA is not looking to own those technologies or those capabilities. We're looking to purchase the consumables produced by them, right? To be a sort of anchor tenant. So we kind of bookend that whole process, right? Technology, we're trying to work to develop those scaled capabilities, push them there, make sure they get there. And then on the other end, it will be the NASA users as well as commercial users that will be purchasing those consumables. We talk a lot about what being an anchor tenant means from a government perspective there. So those are the kind of conversations we have to have, and I think that will ultimately drive out the finite answer to that, Ben. I don't know if Walt has anything to add there.
Nikki said it well. The only thing I would add is that really is to us the definition of a sustainable lunar plan and infrastructure, and we need your help to define what that actually is, and what is the infrastructure that needs to be developed and placed on the surface of the moon so that it's accessible long-term. I view it kind of like we've done in low Earth orbit now with the International Space Station and now commercial space stations being developed. I mean, once we get to the point where we can have a commercial presence on the moon, that will allow us to move forward and go on to Mars and other destinations.
Not working. Okay, Ben muted me. Very importantly, though, I'll say, I should mention, one of our key tenets, in addition to these go, land, live, explore technical areas in space tech, is lunar economy, developing a robust lunar economy. So, like I said, those things very much go hand in hand.
Great. Just to show that breaking your microphone doesn't shield you from questions. For landing pads, what is the current thought about preparing a new one for each lander versus dealing with the problem of having to remove a descent stage off it and reusing one?
That's a great question. There's a lot to that question as well. So we've been interacting with some industry folks to get their feel for what their need is for landing pads. And we've definitely been getting a response, a positive response, that they would like landing pads to support their version of a lander. And so one of the struggles that we have currently, and I sort of alluded to it quickly in my talk, was understanding sort of the design requirements, you know, thrust loads, temperatures, ejecta, particle ejecta, and how you would prevent that from going out and damaging things. So setting up blast containment shields and that sort of thing. How then, if you have a single use, how you remove a descent stage from the landing pad. I think there's some very simple concepts that we've come up with of ways that you could pull them off to the side, potentially take them to a recycling facility, for example. I think there's still a lot of study needed to be done in terms of developing the requirements so we can say something intelligent about their actual design. And I think it's going to be talking to industry, getting a better understanding of what the load requirements are.
Okay, thank you. There was actually another question you touched upon about the idea that using discarded items, sort of repurposing them, particularly in sort of additive construction. Life support systems, including growing plants, was mentioned. Is that part of is there an LSIC group that is covered by?
You go ahead.
That sort of falls under ISRU. That's kind of one of those difficult areas because it crosses over into Eclipse a little bit and human support. You know, it's an area that has been dabbled in and that we're trying to keep going. Obviously, you know, when we're talking about ISRU, there's the near term and long term and sort of the capability build-up areas. But in terms of LSIC, I guess I would start with the ISRU group. I can't think of where else it would fit.
Yeah, it's not really part of LSIC. Of course, in space tech, we do work with our counterparts in ESDMD and with Eclipse, but primarily that's more of an ESDMD focal area.
Regarding the developing these envisioned futures, is there a mechanism for public input after more and more details are released?
Yeah, I think that's what the RFI, the request for information, really is all about. It's seeking public input. The release of the LIV RFI, which we're kind of talking about here, is actually coming out this month. In fact, I think next week is the plan. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what we're saying.
And it will be open for about 6 weeks. And then we'll collect what inputs we have and sort of combine those and report them out in the fall. That doesn't mean that's the only opportunity. There will be ongoing opportunities. This is just our first step. So take advantage of it if you can. We'd love to hear your input. But if you don't get it in now, I promise there will be future opportunities. I would say we'll probably do another one of these about 6 months in the fall and talk about it more then. So.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and Ben, I'll just add, that's one of the reasons we wanted to have Jim and Walt announce that here is so much of the LSI relative areas do fall under LIV, and they will be linked from the LSIC website and discussed in the focus group as well. So there'll be plenty of time for discussion, and like Walt said, it'll be an iterative process.
Okay. So I'm going to merge a couple here. Are there future Eclipse missions with payload development funds, essentially specifically for STMD-led deliveries in the area of the two that were mentioned were ISRU and excavation and construction surface demonstrations?
So I'll say, I think you've seen a few of them in the charts here. Matter of fact, some that Julie showed with on the ISRU roadmap with that 2026 timeframe, 2028 timeframe, both for power, ISRU, excavation, and construction, which of course we all know embedded in that is access to the places we need to get and surviving the environment. So yes, that is a big part of our roadmap. Now the big caveat to that, I will go back to what Bob Cabana said yesterday and what Jim had stressed, and I think what we've mentioned several times is all of that is dependent on, on our budgets, right? So we are working closely with our Science Mission Directorate and the Eclipse program. We do have allocation. We do have, I think, around 25 or so pre-manifested payloads, and of course we get others that come in through, ACOs and tipping points, and we're hoping to also increase opportunities for STEM and activities as well as crowdsourcing. You heard about the Honey, I Shrunk the Payload. We had 3 flight hardware units delivered for that small Scout, which Cadre is flying in 2025, I believe, late 2025. So yes, we have a very ambitious and exciting plan. As we've talked about here, those opportunities are really, really key. We do everything we can on the ground, but the moon's a tough environment, right? And when you look at the systems on systems and environment on systems effects, it's just really critical that we take advantage and leverage every opportunity, not only for the technologies, but the materials and the processes, the operations. So that is a big focus, and we do hope to be able to leverage every opportunity we get there.
So I know we don't have every capability area sitting at the table, but for those that are, which high priority gap do you think is the hardest for you to close?
Okay, for me, it's the reliable power electronics in the radiation environment. That's a problem that's rather subtle, But if we want to have a sustainable, reliable power grid on the lunar surface, we're going to have to deal with that in a way that we face a challenge that other applications of those things, even in space, don't face. And I think we have to spend some time, probably at a fundamental level, understanding how to predict the reliability of a given circuit design with given materials before we can think we know how to make a selection about what combination of semiconductors, circuit topology, shielding to take material 6 and onto a flight design.
For me, I think it's excavation for construction. Kind of a hard choice, but I never tried to build anything on the moon, so understanding how the regolith behaves as we're operating with it, how does it compact? Is it going to do what we think it's going to do in 0G with all the different unknowns associated with what's in the material? How does it levitate if it's charged? Just the whole working with regolith is something that until we get there, we're really not going to know exactly how it goes. And how do implements, whether it's digging or grading or compacting, how do those implements really working with the regolith? I think that's going to be, I think that's my biggest concern right now. I think some of the other areas are a little bit better understood.
So I'll take kind of the easy out on this one because a lot of our gaps, like I said, kind of had common themes. So it's really that longevity and the autonomous operations for that longevity that's our major concern for ISRU. I mean, autonomous mining isn't done on Earth, and we're trying to do it on another planet. So there's a lot of concerns that, tied to what Mark just said with the, just how we interact with the surface material and that being part of that extreme environment challenge. So a lot of those gaps, whether it's a valve or whether it's a vehicle, an excavator, or whatever it is that have to interact with those environments for the long term autonomously, that's really our big concern.
Yeah, so, I want to charge the hill on this one real quick, Ben. I just want to say everything you talked about here is absolutely a huge hurdle, right? But I think we have plans and the right people to address those and the opportunity, right? For me, what keep me up at night list would be for this mid-TRL, for where we're at with these things now, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, having the resources we need to leverage the opportunities right now. Because I think there can be a perception sometimes, right, that the mid-TRL stuff can kind of wait. And if you're 5 years out now, you're going to be 5 years out 5 years from now, right? So it's one of those things that it's not really only the future impact of not doing these things now, it really is kind of an imminent impact. Like we talked about the Eclipse opportunities, everyone that we're not on is a missed opportunity that from a schedule and a risk perspective add up. So again, I think that's why, not to be too kumbaya, but it's why this organization, this consortium, it's why, seriously, y'all participating in this today, you participating in the focus groups, hearing your feedback, getting that advocacy, us making these plans together, it's why that is so critical, I think, to all of these capability areas being developed.
Thank you. Another ISRU one, is there enough carbon in lunar regolith that you can consider extracting it either to make methane or polymers?
It's a consideration. There's not a lot. Whatever there is, there's not a lot. So moving downstream long-term, we can certainly consider looping those kind of things in. Obviously that's a much more viable opportunity on Mars to get methane directly because of the CO2 atmosphere. So there's certainly great opportunities for that on Mars. For the moon, we're a little more restricted, and especially in the near term. Again, for these lower level resources, it's how hard is it to get, and what's the yield and the time frame that you can get that yield in, and whether that's a useful resource over time for the applications it has. And I think that kind of fits into that category. Yeah.
And so what is the maturity level of autonomy versus telerobotic our operations for both sort of high-level task as well as low-level ops?
Our strategy for dealing with that, obviously, telerobotics would be something we could do in near term because the time delay isn't that bad. But we certainly want to be trying out ways to make things autonomous, but not to overcomplicate systems if we don't need to. So our going in plan is to try and do as much telerobotic, but automating repeated tasks. For example, if you're going back and forth between a mine and a place where you're doing a refinery or type thing, then you could do very simple autonomy type of, going back and forth. As you start getting into more advanced autonomy, you add in situations where you're going into unexplored terrain or you're going to inspect and repair something, and so you really don't know what you have until you get there, and then you have to have some ability to characterize that situation and effect a repair. Again, if you're on the moon, that may be something that you could do over the phone, but if it's something on Mars, you're clearly not going to be able to do that, but you want to test that capability on the moon.
Well, thank you. Well, that brings the end to the session. I'd like everyone to thank all the speakers.